This is My Playbook. I'm Simon Mundy, and in this podcast, created by Greenhouse Sports, we'll be hearing from a host of inspiring people about who and what inspired, supported, and encouraged them during difficult moments. We'll find out what they've learned along the way, as well as what they want to share and pass on. Greenhouse Sports is the charity that uses sport to help disadvantaged young people and communities. Their core belief is that every child deserves opportunities and a fair chance to get on in life. And through Greenhouse's coaches and partners, they look to make that a reality. The work they do is about encouraging young people through sport and teaching them the life skills they need. 2022 is Greenhouse's 20th anniversary, and over the last 20 years, the charity has helped more than 50,000 children in London, but there are a further 4 million children across the UK right now that they would like to help. And if you'd like to find out more about their work and how you could help support another generation of young people, please head to greenhousesports.org to find out more. In the meantime, to this episode, in which I speak to one of Britain's greatest ever athletes and Olympians, Seb Coe. He won 1500 metres gold at the 1980 and 1984 Olympics, was absolutely fundamental in securing London as the host city for the 2012 Olympic Games, and is now the president of World Athletics. Seb Coe is also an ambassador for Greenhouse Sports through the Sebastian Coe Foundation.
That's the great quality that good coaches bring. You sort of feel that you're the only one that matters in their world. On the occasions I have met Her Majesty the Queen, she has exactly that ability. And it's born, I think, of a deep interest in people.
In this episode, Seb talks about the power of opportunity and role models, the key moments along his journey, as well as why organisations like Greenhouse Sports are able to use the power of sport to change lives. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Lord Coe, what an absolute pleasure to speak to you, to see you. How are you?
I'm in great form, thank you. I'm sitting here in my World Athletics headquarters in Monaco. The sun is shining and, all's well with the world, but it's only 11 o'clock in the morning.
Well, bizarrely, the sun is shining here too, which takes me back to the halcyon days of London 2012, which is one of many things we're going to touch on during the course of our chat. But I do appreciate you sparing the time because I know you have a very busy in-tray. Have you got a lot on your plate today?
Yeah, I do. Because of the concertinaing of the calendar, I'm off to the Commonwealth Games, the European Championships, the North America, Central America, Caribbean Championships, and then into the end of the Diamond League season. So it's busy at the moment operationally.
Indeed. Yes. Goodness, that's tiring just listening to that. So clearly you still got the energy burning that took you to those famous Olympic triumphs.
Well, yeah, look, I genuinely feel privileged to be doing what I'm doing. I joined an athletics club at the age of 11. I sort of made it through the ranks into the senior team, ran internationally for a number of years. And, I'm now president of the sport that I owe everything to. So, yeah, why wouldn't I have the energy to do this for as long as I can?
Indeed. And your story does read a little bit like not even a little bit like, very much like a film script, Lord Coe. Do you mind if I call you Seb?
No, I would much prefer you to call me Seb, actually.
Okay, Seb it is. And I'd love to extract sort of the lessons that you've learnt along the way. And there's so much to talk about. So let's dive in. And I want to return to your childhood days. And in particular, walking in to do the 11 plus. Because this was a bit of a key moment. So can we start there, please?
Yeah, look, I wasn't a complete dunce, but I wasn't really academically at that stage probably that focused. I would think I was like a lot of 11-year-olds. I was, trying to figure out how I would get to the next Chelsea match. I was beginning to develop a real interest and love of sport. I'd started running at sort of primary school level, and, nothing really, I guess, like for most kids, nothing really seemed to be that important. And I failed my 11 plus. It's probably the best thing that ever happened to me. I then went to a secondary mod, and we moved to Sheffield. And I'm probably one of the few kids around, certainly people around, that actually can claim that they went to a secondary modern, a comprehensive, and a grammar school. Because I failed my 11 plus, went to a secondary modern. I then, my secondary modern in the early 70s suddenly became a comprehensive. And then, in order to do my A levels, which were not available at the school I was at, I then had to go to a grammar school. So I finally made it to a grammar school at the age of 16.
Yeah,
So
took the long route.
There weren't 5 entirely lost years, but actually looking back, I'm really pleased I had that experience, because I think it taught me a whole heap more about the human condition, really, than had I sort of been through a more elite education.
And everyone faces setbacks, and they can always feel crushing at the time and of monumental importance, as if, you fail an exam and that means that your future is not going to be what you hoped it to be. But, it's such an important lesson, particularly for young people, is that just because things don't go the way you hoped that they would, as they didn't for you, that's not the end.
Well, look, I'll make 2 observations. The first is the ridiculous, bizarre nature of sort of trying to select kids at the age of 11 and telling a small percentage that they're the chosen few, and the rest of us that it doesn't. There is no empirical evidence at all in anything, in any education model, that would really lead you to think that that is a sensible solution at the age of 11. But actually, it was interesting. I have a foundation. I interviewed Toto Wolff the other day, and I asked Toto exactly the same type of question you're asking me. And Toto's view, team boss of Mercedes, the dynasty, 8 world championships in a row. I mean, he's created something that's unlikely to be repeated, certainly in the foreseeable future. And he thought that performance and enduring performance was normally born during formative years from massive setback, hurt, or loss. And his view was that you wouldn't go out to seek those situations. But for instance, he lost his father when he was young. His mother was actually a doctor, but came from a modest background. Everything he did, he felt he was driven because of that early adversity. And there's no question to me that if you speak to a lot of people, a lot of high performing people, there's often a moment of inflection where they've had to deal with something, physically or mentally, fairly traumatic. Certainly, if you look at our top Paralympic athletes, so many will tell you that story, that they've come back from real challenge to excel. And so, look, I'm not saying that you would wish adversity on anybody, but there does seem to be some commonality amongst top performers in any sphere, and some moment where they've had that come to Jesus moment.
Yes, that's something I've read a lot about myself as well. So a couple of questions on that. So was failing the 11 plus, did it feel at the time like a terminal thing? Was it traumatic for you?
I wouldn't say it was traumatic, but I remember feeling, the whole group of people I knew in the school went in one direction, and I was going to a school where, I was tended to be in the garden most of the day, planting potatoes. I mean, at the age of 13, I couldn't read or write, but I could spot a dodgy King Edwards from 30 yards. And I always remember, funnily enough, I do remember, history has always been my passion. And I remember handing in a piece of homework at this school and being called out after the lesson by the teacher. And he looked at me and handed me the book. And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, I didn't really know the answer. I didn't really understand the question. I said, he said, no, seriously, why are you here? So I said, well, because basically I have to be. And he went, no. Why are you at this school? He said, you shouldn't be at this school. And he handed me my homework back, and he said, did you do this yourself? And I went, yeah, of course I did. I'm not parents that were going to sit there writing history essays for me. There were 4 other kids in the family. And he said, well, you shouldn't be here. And it was the first time that I realized, again, looking back, and in a way he gave voice to what I've just said, that at the age of 11, there are all sorts of passions that kids have. And our challenge in society now is to unearth that talent and dig deep, because talent and ability doesn't come in nicely wrapped boxes with pink ribbons on. You really do have to dig, and I actually think that the litmus test for any country is in 2 key areas. What do you do to encourage people with passion that they may not even know within the education system to excel and to be set on a path that, great teachers, great coaches start with a blank canvas, and they just help the athlete or the student with a few brush strokes. And then there has to be a point, and it's often inspirational teaching or coaching that is the diving board. And then the second litmus test for me is are you really, as a country, prepared to extol and support excellence and fund it properly? And I don't really care whether it comes in sport or academic or business or the cultural sector. But really, if you have outstanding talent, you really do have to help resource it, because it's it's one of those things that defines and distinguishes the nation. It's a brand value. And I do think that how you deal with excellence in a country is, for me, pretty totemic of what else will happen in that country.
We've spoken about setbacks not necessarily being a bad thing, and as you've said, the unfairness in many ways of being judged at 11 at such a formative age. But another key thing, both in your story, but certainly from a societal point of view, is opportunity itself. Meeting the right people at the right time, going to the right clubs, the right schools, etc. And in your case, a place and a person I'd like to bring up is, first of all, that decision to move to Sheffield. Had that not happened, do you think you would be potentially sitting where you are right now? And then also, obviously, mentors is a key thing we're talking about. David Jackson, the geography teacher. Could you just talk to those 2 things, please, Seb?
Yeah, Sheffield it was a really big move for me. I mean, I was born in London. I've got a real, quite a interesting background, because my grandfather was Indian. My mother was born in the hotel that the family had in Delhi. She and her sister then returned to the UK. My dad is an East Londoner, born from very, very modest. I mean, really modest. I mean, modest is a bit of a euphemism. I mean, he was born very, very poor. And I was born in London, but he was an engineer who ended up sort of moving north all the time. So we went from London to, when I was a toddler, to the West Midlands, where he had manufacturing engineering roles. And then we lived in Stratford-on-Avon in Warwickshire, and then he got a production directorship at a cutlery business in Sheffield. So we moved to Sheffield when I was about 11. And that was really a big moment for me. Would I have done what I did in athletics had I not been in Sheffield? Possibly. But I have to say, being there in a great athletics club, in an environment, crossing paths with an inspirational teacher who was also my form teacher, who also, this is David Jackson, who ran cross country for Derbyshire schools, who actually, identified my talent in a slightly bizarre set of circumstances because I was playing football at the time. The referee, the PE teacher, thought I was using language that was unbecoming, and he sent me off around the school playing fields to do 5 laps as punishment. David Jackson happened to be out there because he also took PE and was a good hockey player, and he was taking a hockey lesson and looked at this sort of skinny kid running around the school, and he went, okay, he actually walked up to me and he just said, I think you might be in the wrong sport. We then struck up a friendship, and that was fantastic because, first of all, he also was responsible for my passionate love of maps and all things geographical. He also took me for what was in old money religious instruction, RE, RI. And he'd often sidle up to me in a lesson, and he'd go, because he understood the nature of endurance running, he'd come up to me and say, how's your mileage this week? And if I looked at him and went, well, it's a bit on the low side, he'd go, off you go. So he would actually slip me from the class. So he was an atheist, Dave, but I ended up teaching RE. So this probably says a great deal more about my spiritual underpinning and his than it does about very much else. But he was an inspirational figure, and throughout that period, of course, I joined an athletics club. He encouraged me to do that. I joined an athletics club. My father, who was an engineer, classically had that view that, the job of an engineer is to observe and then sort of take things apart and then put them back together again so they work better. He watched at the side of the track while I was doing these training sessions with the club coaches there, and in the most respectful way, just didn't think what he watched me doing. It didn't make a lot of sense to him, although he didn't come from a track and field background. He came from a cycling background. So, and he only went down to the track because my mother couldn't figure out where her 11-year-old, 12-year-old son was going every Tuesday night, Thursday night, and Sunday mornings, and Saturdays, off racing everywhere. So he was basically sent to check out what I was doing. And he then slowly, sort of almost osmotically, absorbed everything. He was, he understood endurance. He was a racing cyclist. He was actually a pretty decent road racer. He cycled for Herne Hill, one of the good cycling clubs in South London. And that's how he became involved. So those are 2 huge figures in my athletics career. And David remained a friend, sadly, until he passed away a few years ago. And David was the first to write a note of congratulation or commiseration if I lost a race, or there was something that he has observed, in the vagaries of public life that he wanted to draw my attention to. So he was an assiduous letter writer, and I've kept all his letters. And no, he was a lovely guy.
Yes. So he was a RE teacher and an atheist, but he was clearly a touch of a guardian angel. And it's amazing how...
Yeah, great humanitarian. I mean, a real humanitarian. He was always in the corner of the underdog, who fought tooth and nail for people in his class.
And people like that, Seb, if you are fortunate enough to come across someone like that, the difference someone like that can make in the life of a young person, as he did in yours, is crucial and key, isn't it? And so the children who get those opportunities are very fortunate.
Yes, it is. And look, sadly, it can be a little bit of a lottery. The number of people, you know them, you have friends who will tell you that their passion for something was inspired by great teaching or great coaching. And it's always been my view that if you expose young people to something really different at a formative point in their lives, you can absolutely set the direction of travel. You can absolutely set the direction of travel. And so often that, that inspirational moment will come from a teacher. I think if you had 50 people on this podcast and you ask them all, it will be a combination of inspiration from either family or teachers. So often it's that, or volunteers in sports clubs, coaches. I would hazard a guess that if you had the Venn diagram, most of that grey area would be filled with family, teachers, and coaches.
And that's why the work that an organisation like Greenhouse Sports does
is essential. It's life changing, and there's no grey area here. It is life changing, and I've seen it. I've been very privileged to work closely with Greenhouse, and I talked about my foundation. We've for a few years now, we've been supporting Greenhouse, and I've seen it from the the desktop drawings, the reconversion of the centre in Marylebone, and table tennis has broadened into outreach programs and after school programs, and now coaching in schools all over the place. So no, it's absolute game changer.
You mentioned table tennis, and one of the Greenhouse Sports mentors, coaches that I've been lucky enough to talk to is a chap called Jason Sugru, very talented table tennis player. And he came out with a fantastic line where he was offered an opportunity to work with elite sport. And he said, no, for me, the opportunity to change the lives of people who are in need superseded that. Now, you're someone who's obviously got a foot in both camps. How do you compare the two? Obviously, doing what you have done, both as an athlete, as an administrator, what you're doing currently, and then, though, through, for example, your foundation, through Greenhouse Sports, that ability to really impact the lives of people who haven't got quite those same advantages that many of us are lucky enough to get.
Look, in a perfect world, you'd do both, wouldn't you? Now, people often have tiresome arguments or discussions with me about, if you go back in, certainly British sport for the last 30 or 40 years, sporadically we have these rather tiresome discussions about, should we be funding excellence or is it all about participation? It's about both. It's about both.
Yeah.
They're both inextricably linked. Now, if I will always believe that the well-stocked shop window attracts people into the store. If you've got a cluster of lustrous Olympians like Mo Farah and Jess Ennis and Chris Hoy and Sarah Weir, people like that, then you have got the shop window. Now, not everybody is going to be attracted in because they want to be a Mo Farah, but I've just seen the impact Mo Farah has. When he wanders through, a crowd after an athletics event or when he's actually just out there. It's huge. And we also, post-COVID, really have a responsibility. Governments have rather belatedly woken up to the fact that they actually should have a responsibility. They should be accountable for, health and well-being, particularly amongst young people in tough communities. Now, I genuinely, for all sorts of reasons, not just because it's been my life, but I actually genuinely think that sport and investment in sport, and not just elite sport, but participation and the type of stuff that Greenhouse does in the voluntary sector, is the best social policy you'll ever have. It's the best education, health, economic, civil society, social cohesion, nation building set of policies you'll ever have. And the investment is minuscule compared to the challenge if you don't have kids physically active, mentally in a good place. And physical inactivity, we know, is going to be the huge drag anchor on, our ability to maintain, global status economically. I don't want to reduce it simply to, lots of people working really hard, but the nature of the world is, particularly post-COVID, that the lesson we've learned is we went into COVID with these rather sort of mushy journalistic observations and political observations. I probably made them myself. We're all in this together. It's going to be the great leveler. It wasn't the great leveler. It hit it hit those communities who have always been vulnerable to disruption, economic, social, political. It hit them harder than it hit those that had the ability to withstand that. And so actually using sport and I would say athletics, wouldn't I? Because I think that's the most accessible of all sports. You don't need expensive cars or yachts or massive equipment. If you've got a body, you're an athlete, you can roll out of your front door and you can jog. I mean, it's about as simple as that. And 1.5 billion people over the course of a few weeks identified themselves as leisure runners around the world. And more people do what we do than any other sport. So I think sport should position itself now, particularly post-COVID, not just as a sort of, it's about elite sport and medals and, where do we finish on a league table or, Downing Street receptions because somebody does something outstanding. If politicians were smart, governments were smart, they would realize that actually a good sports policy is going to help them build up the immunity or the health and well-being and the ability of vulnerable communities to withstand these shocks better than they currently are.
Well, I've heard you talk about during your Hall of Fame athletics career that your mental strength came in a big part from the physical well-being and conditioning that you had. And the link between the two is so close. I know, speaking from my own experience, when I'm fit, I feel better equipped to deal with the highs and lows of life.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, even today, I run every other day. I try to do something modestly each day, but running for me is a lifesaver. I know I can have 3 or 4 things that I think are, challenging problems. They're rolling around in your head like a tumble dryer, really. I can go out for a run, and an hour later, I'm asking myself, what is the issue? It suddenly, things become a whole heap clearer. And I think that the mental cleansing, in a way, that you get from, modest amounts of exercise, and I'm not talking about Olympic programs, I'm just talking about the ability to go out and walk. It's really important. It's really important. And we're falling so we are sadly falling so far below, any of the World Health Organization levels of, physical fitness. I mean, we're way off the pace, and we're not the only country that's in that situation.
Yes, it's a concerning trend, certainly, and that brings me to another of your key mentors. So George Gandy at Loughborough University, the man who introduced you to revolutionary stuff that really, helped you. But I read an interesting article actually that he had written where he was talking about how youngsters are not getting out and playing and using their legs like they used to, and he was talking about how worried that makes him for the future. And you've touched on it there, but how worried are you that young people are not getting the same levels of physical activity that they even did a few generations ago?
I think it's a profound concern. I can't remember the exact statistic, but I won't be that far wrong. I think between the age of 8 or 9 and 12 or 13, the average child in the UK becomes 50% less active. You speak to any general practitioner, you speak to any healthcare professional, they'll tell you that they're dealing now with illnesses and pathologies that they would normally have been dealing with people in sort of late middle age. They're now dealing with sometimes in their people, are got type 2 diabetes, other issues that you wouldn't normally see until you're late middle ages. They're now dealing with this for some people in their late 20s. So this is a problem. This is a problem. And look, I did some work for David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, immediately after the London Games. And he was very focused on the need to do something about physical inactivity. He could see that it was an issue. And we created a unit, which I sort of headed up for a little bit from the Cabinet Office. And it was really about getting all the different government departments to recognise that they had a part to play in this. That the days of saying, well, somebody's obese, so it's a problem for the NHS, if it's ever made sense, it certainly doesn't make sense now. And it was really good because for the very first time, and we really did make some progress, we're in a cabinet subcommittee where, you had the Secretary of State for Defence, you had the Secretary of State for Transport, Education, Health, DCMS, and everybody began to recognize that they had a part to play in that. So, for instance, I remember when we were doing some work talking to a group of kids in East London. I went back to one of the schools that we worked very closely with during the Games. And I started asking them questions. I knew what the answer would be. So, for instance, I said to them, well, so, what about walking to school? What about riding a bike? Well, bikes are expensive, and often they would explain that there wasn't anywhere to leave them. And if you left them, most places they get stolen. And walking to school or even cycling to school meant sometimes going across a gang boundary, which was a risk. You're suddenly recognizing this has got nothing to do with the National Health Service. It's about law enforcement. It's about policing. If you think, for instance, that you want more people to exercise, then you have to do something about your planning system. So it's not NHS, it's planning. And if you genuinely think that it's better to zero rate reading matter because you want a nation of people that read, or you want kids to go to school properly clothed, so you zero rate school clothing or children's clothing, then why would you not think about doing the same for gym memberships or tax breaks for volunteer sports clubs or gym equipment? So that then becomes about tax and spend. It's a treasury issue. So I don't think you're going to make the kind of progress that you or I or the people that are the founding inspiration behind Greenhouse want to make until government recognizes that it's very much a cross-departmental issue. And sadly, that fell into abeyance really when David left office and a new leader came in who just really didn't see the value of it. And it's a shame because I do think that is a template that can work.
Yes, it's the difference in many ways between the ambulance at the bottom of the hill and the fence at the top. Right, Seb, I want to get back to the mentors. We've touched on George and David. I want to move on to your father now, but just a quick word on people like George and David. How much of a base are people like that, the values they hold and the empathy they have for other people? How much of a factor is that in the way mentors can really influence and impact people's lives in such a profound way?
It's everything. And, George worked with me and he worked with top athletes like Jack Buckner and Paula Radcliffe. But the other great thing was that George also worked with athletes with less talent. And he took as much pleasure out of getting 100%, 120% out of an athlete that doubted their own ability. And it was really interesting at his funeral. It really didn't matter the quality of the athlete. Everybody felt that as far as George was concerned, he was their coach. And he knew as much about them as anybody else in their lives. And I think that's the great quality that good coaches bring. And that is that, for those moments you're with them in your career, you sort of feel that you're the only one that matters in their world.
Yes. Well, they talk about that sort of thing when it comes to charisma. And I'm not talking about faking it and pretending that the person you're speaking to is the most important person in the room. But if you can genuinely treat someone in that way, people can't help but be drawn to you. And also, more importantly, the impact you can have on someone is so very profound.
Let me sort of broaden it out. I know I wouldn't obviously put her in the mentoring category, but, on the occasions I have met Her Majesty the Queen, and it's a topical moment because it's, we've just gone through an amazing jubilee. She has exactly that ability, that clearly well briefed, but the conversation is not stilted, and it's born, I think, of a deep interest in people. And I think good coaches, good mentors, good teachers are fundamentally got to like people. They want to feel that they are permanently on a mission just to get the best out of people, regardless of whether they're ultimately going to be able to convert that talent into an Olympic medal or maybe winning a club championship. But for great coaches, that is still as big an honor and as big an incentive. And I think the commonality here is, how do I get the most out of people?
Yes, I think that's such an important point to emphasize. In this day of marginal gains and the golden bullet, actually, as you said with the Queen, it's that love and empathy and interest in people that actually is top of the list. Now, Seb, I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit to the Federer-Nadal rivalry of the 80s. You know of whom I'm speaking, you and Steve Ovett, and the role, obviously, your father played in your dramatic Olympics in 1980. Firstly, just to mention, obviously, you raced actually against Steve Ovett first time in 1972. Neither of you won the race, which I found very interesting.
No, we didn't. I think he finished ninth. I finished ninth. He finished second.
And then, so 1979, you had a fantastic season, 3 world records in 41 days. But let's move to Moscow 1980. So there you were. And people talk about, because there was the boycott, but for the middle distance, it didn't matter. It was all about you. And I've heard people say it wasn't the Moscow Games, it was the Coe-Ovett Games. And I know you, obviously your love of Chelsea precedes you, but I think it's wonderful to look back and realise that athletics at that time knocked football off its perch, to borrow one of Sir Alex Ferguson's famous phrases. But for those people who aren't aware of the events of 1980, that summer, you were favourite to win the 800. Steve Ovett was favourite to win the 1500. Now, I've read you talk about your father recognising that the night before the 800 metres final, he could sense that something wasn't quite up with you and didn't quite know what to do. So can you just talk a little bit about what difficulty perhaps you found ahead of that race, and also the difficulty perhaps your father found and your relationship, how it fitted into that?
Yeah, look, I mean, Moscow, for all sorts of reasons, I won't go back into the history of it, was a challenge for anybody there because if you remember the then Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, plus ça change. The Americans under Jimmy Carter pushed for a boycott. Margaret Thatcher, freshly elected Prime Minister, wanted to solidify the US, British special relationship. She fell in behind them. The Germans fell in behind. The Australians did as well. And there was a big political stage before we even got to the competition. I mean, there were training sessions I was doing in Sheffield in sort of April, May, where I was questioning whether I'd even be at the games, but having to maintain your focus through that was really quite important. And I had come through, you mentioned the world records in 1979. Although I was the world record holder, which actually breaking 3 world records in 41 days on the eve of an Olympic Games is not the best way to go into a Games with a low profile and no pressure. So, for many who were probably a little less tutored in the nature of my sport, just automatically assume, well, if you're the world record holder at those distances, you're automatically going to win. So for half the nation, I'd already gone there with medals hanging around my neck. Of course, it's never quite that easy. And although I was running fast, I had only really, up to that point, had one experience of championship racing, and that was in the 1978 European Championships in Prague. I was still a university student at Loughborough. And anybody that competes at that level will tell you there's a mountain of difference. I mean, it's like the difference between county cricket and test match cricket. It's the difference between, the championship in football and getting into the national team. I mean, the jump is massive. And a lot of people don't make it. And it's often not just simply about physical ability. It's your ability to sustain the focus and to withstand some of the pressures that come with, competitions and championships and Olympic Games. So I went to Moscow in supreme physical condition for all of the reasons I explained to you, but probably less equipped than many in those championships to deal with the pressures of a big competition. Then throw in the best athlete of arguably the most naturally talented athlete I ever ran against. The guy had gone 40-something of races undefeated at the distance. And, you had the perfect storm. And on the night before the 800, I didn't feel quite right. I didn't sleep, which is unusual for me. I can sleep through anything. And then the following morning, I just felt I was clumsy. I remember, dropping a jug of milk when I was putting, I was just not in the. And my father, who was a good observer, and it's to his, to his dying days, literally, he said it was the toughest call he had to make because he sensed that I wasn't myself. And the big coaching conundrum was, do I say something and risk, and he's fine, and risk putting something in his mind that makes him think that I'm questioning? Or do I say something, or do I just sort of leave it alone and, and almost buck my own instincts? I actually had a really revealing conversation with Eddie Jones, the England rugby coach, and I told him about this. He said, your father had the classic coaching dilemma. He said it is the biggest dilemma any coach faces. When is the right moment to say something? When is it not the right moment to say something? And he said, when you told me that story, he said, I can think of so many occasions I've been in that position. And my father, to his dying day, literally regretted he didn't say something, because he said if we'd actually had this out around the table and we just sat and talked about, all the things you'd done to get to where you'd got to, and, the speed and the pace and your qualities as an athlete, I think you'd have probably been okay. In a way, it's all irrelevant because Steve deserved to win the 800. There's no question about it. He was the better athlete on the day, and I made loads and loads of mistakes. I mean, I don't think I've ever run actually a worse 800 in my life. I mean, it would have been hard to replicate that, even if I tried to do it. And interestingly, so that was when it was then not about my father or my coach or George or any of my backroom team. I then had to deal with that loss myself over the next 3 or 4 days before I got back on the track for the 1500. And that's a lonely moment where you just sit there and you go, actually, the only person that can, resurrect this moment is you. It's not coaches. It isn't your mentors. It's not Dave Jackson. You've got to take responsibility for this.
And I heard a lovely story that for me illustrated the power of perspective and humor. So correct me if I'm wrong. The next morning, you're in bed, tucked up, not wanting to get out of bed. In storms the one and only Daley Thompson.
Yeah, my closest friend. Yeah, and I was sort of lying there, and he went, literally, so what are you doing? I went, oh, yeah. And I said lamely to him, what does the weather look like? And Daley ripped open the curtains, which, for Daley means almost pulling them out of the wall. And he looked out there and he just turned back to me and he went, it all looks a bit silver out there. And that is the Daley Thompson School of Psychotherapy. And it was funny. I mean, I remember laughing at the time, and it was probably the beginning of probably the beginning of the return journey.
Well, that certainly gives the impression. I can't imagine Daley thinking, should I or should I not say something? It would always be should.
No. There are no. They're very. Yes. Daley has very few filters. If it's on his mind, he will say it, which is a great if a little disarming attribute.
Yes, indeed. But it's fantastic that was in some ways a bit of a trigger for you to regroup, and you did regroup brilliantly. And I mean, David Coleman saying what an incredible comeback for when you did win the 1500, and Steve Ovett had been unbeaten for so long in the event, and to actually come back and win the 1500 meters gold. In fact, if you wouldn't mind just moving your head just slightly to the left, Lord Coe, just so we can see. So there it is.
Well, that's
there we go, right there. And you lifting your arms as you cross the line, and you could see the joy and the satisfaction when you did that. But I mean, to come back from the disappointment of the 1800 and then be able to regroup and win an event in which you weren't expected to win. What if you had to distill that down into one brief lesson that anyone could take from coming back from a disappointment, which we all go through, and yours was obviously magnified and amplified, but what would you say to anyone about what you learned?
I think you have to make an assessment of, at that moment, whether it's a race, whether it's a business deal, whether it's a moment of a personal crisis, whatever it happens to be. I think you have to ask yourself three questions. The first is, where are you? Where are you at this moment?
Yeah.
It's a proper audit, and it's an internal audit, and only you can answer that.
And be honest with yourself about it.
You have to be brutally honest with yourself. The second question you then ask is, well, where do I want to be? And the third question is pretty obvious: is how do I get there?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's much more than that. I did permanently keep reminding myself that, to famously quote David Coleman, you don't become a bad athlete overnight. We can all have a bad day in the office, but it shouldn't define your whole career.
Every day's a new day kind of thing. Yeah.
Every day is a new day. And that there were things that I just had to keep reminding myself. And actually, some of it was about friends and family and support, and sometimes sacrifice, which I know my own family made to support me. And then remind yourself about the hundreds and hundreds of miles you've run across Derbyshire, the
Updale,
Derbyshire
Downdale
District, hills in Sheffield, the weight training sessions that have left you so tired you could barely grip the steering wheel from in the car for half an hour after you've done them. And you just have to keep reminding yourself about what it is that has forged you in the first place and why you're doing it.
Yeah. And
actually the why in all that is often, I think, at those moments as important as, well, how do I get out of this hole? And it's inevitably a suffusion of the two. And that's what those few days were about, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would recommend anyone to go back and watch the two races. They are utterly compelling. And then 4 years later, you were very rare in being able to defend your title in the 1500 against the odds again. And you turned to the press and gave them the raw because they'd doubted you. So, but I want to skip forward because obviously, that was a great success, but it's far from just being your athletics career. Your career since retiring in 1990. So your sports administration career, and the pinnacle for for many people will be the role you played in London 2012, which obviously for me I was lucky enough to be there. I interviewed you, as you know, for Radio One on the eve of the games when
You know how you got that interview, do you? My kids said, "Don't be boring and just keep appearing on sports programs. Do something interesting." And so they nudged me to Radio One.
I was thrilled. I was thrilled. And I remember just how cool you seemed and so calm and collected, because people forget actually in the run up to the games, there was, some negative headlines and it really did supersede expectations, and even the weather came out. But actually, I want to just return to something a few years previously, which was what was considered to be a fundamental moment in London winning the games, because Paris, and I remember I'd visited Paris in 2005 for that year's French Open tennis, and the Eiffel Tower was lit up with their bid. And London was by no means, a big favourite or anything like that. And you gave a speech to the IOC in 2005 that was seen to be a real turning point. Now, public speaking is considered to be, one of the great fears for so many people. So can you just tell us a little bit about, how you approached that, your attitude during it, and what anyone could learn from grasping an opportunity like that away from athletics?
I was determined to speak, if I allow myself to say this from the heart. This couldn't be a speech that anybody else could write. It wasn't something that, a group of speech writers could sit down and play around and wordsmith. This was such a personal story that I had to convey about the 11-year-old, the inspiration of two teachers in my city of Sheffield who won medals in the Mexico Games, the inspiration for me to go and join an athletics club. And I wanted my story not to be understood because it was my story, but because I genuinely felt that it was the template that the games could adopt for so many kids like me. And so that's all I really did. I told a story. And I remember my communications teams were getting really nervous because it was only like 2 or 3 days beforehand. I still hadn't written the closing speech. And I remember, and I thought, no, it will come. And I'd had thoughts, and I wanted to absorb the journey that the bid had taken me on and the experiences and the people I'd talked to. And I then sat down. I remember it was 4:00 in the morning at the side of a swimming pool in our hotel in Singapore. And I'm not, as people that know me well know that technology is not my sweet spot. So I still write and prefer to write longhand. And I wrote the speech longhand with a fountain pen at the side of the pool at 4:00 in the morning, and the words flowed very easily. And I didn't alter, I returned to it a couple of times, tinkered with a few expressions, but very little of it did I alter. And it was very similar to the opening and the closing speech I made at the games in 2012. Again, was written a couple of nights before, and it was really a synthesis of stories that I'd absorbed from volunteers, and so I think good speech making, and I'm not an expert, but I think good speech making is about storytelling. And don't create a synthetic history. Just, the narrative is so much closer to home than you think. And, on those occasions, it's just worth, not doing it in a hurry, but just letting those experiences almost osmotically absorb. And then you'll find the words. And the great thing that people tend to forget is when you make a speech, actually, unless it's pre-released, so you've got all the politicos sitting at the back of the room and, they can see the sound bites that they're supposed to pick up in their articles and, the clever speechwriter. on most occasions, nobody has a clue about what you're going to say. They're not sitting there with a script going, "Oh, he didn't quite get," or so capturing their imagination through storytelling, I think, is a huge is the difference between good and and great speech makers.
I love what you said there as well, as about trusting that it would come. And I think that speaks volumes, because we can all stress about the future, but trusting that when the moment comes, the resources will be available to you. And it just happened to be at 4 a.m. sat next to a swimming pool.
Yeah, I remember waking up and thinking, I don't know why, I remember waking up thinking, I can write this now.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, powerful. Yeah. Now, last few things, Seb. Yeah. A couple of things that I've read about. Before we get on to the power of sport as a social worker, I read an interview that you did actually with your friend Al, or Alistair Campbell, and he spoke about, you can never replace elite sport. And he spoke about the chasing of winning. I wondered if, on reflection, it is about the chasing of winning, or was it being lost in the moment during those races?
Yeah.
When you were coming around the corner in Moscow, you weren't thinking about, okay, what happened yesterday or what happened tomorrow. You were there in the most pure present form. So which is it? Is it the winning, or is it the joy of the competition and losing yourself? Or is it, again, like you said, mixture of both?
I think it's a mixture of everything, isn't it? Look, I think if you speak to most athletes, most people in sport that get across the line in one way or another, their first emotional response, well, mine was less about the elation of having won. It was the relief of not having let people down. If you think about in my own career, people like my father, my family, George, David, people like that, my backroom team of American, sports, orthopods and, anatomists and all that sort of stuff. They've given, they're not often being paid to do this. They're doing it because they're absolutely passionate about it. They like you. They want to help you. And I think your first emotion getting across the line is, oh, thank God I haven't let them down. I can now face them. It probably shouldn't be, but it is. So it is about the winning, which is important. And yes, you do get lost. I mean, once that gun goes, there's nothing else you think about. It's almost like everything goes blank. You can't, and you don't hear anything. You can be in a stadium with the most extraordinary roar. You don't hear that. I can remember virtually every step of every race I've run, and I can remember when I've made the right decision. I can sadly remember when I've made the wrong decision. But winning is hugely important. But the relief, I think, of getting across the line is not a personal one. It's about the team that's been around you.
Collective. Interesting. Okay. Now, you talk about sport being the greatest social worker. We have touched on this, Seb, but could you just talk to this a little bit? Perhaps in the context of the stuff we've spoken about with Greenhouse, with the government, with activity levels, but the power of sport and its role as a social worker in many ways.
Well, I think it's profound. I think it is the most potent social worker we've got in our community. I would add to that, I think, also at a diplomatic level, which is often overlooked, I think sport is a powerful player as well, certainly in soft power. But going back to the social worker, again, it's, for me, it's only what I've ever experienced. I saw the type of work that went way beyond the role of a coach in a city athletics club in Sheffield in the 70s. I joined Haringey Athletics Club in a really challenged community in northeast London. I know the impact that had. I was very privileged to be captain of Haringey Athletic Club for a few years. 40% of the kids I trained with and were friendly with at that club were born or brought up on the Broadwater Farm estate. You don't have to go back too far to remember the history of that place. The coaches at Haringey were often the only male or female role models in the lives of young people. They were the ones that were always more aware sometimes of what was going on in the lives of those athletes that they coached, way, way beyond the track, and were a network of safety for them. So time and time again, I've just seen the role that sport has played, particularly in really hard-pressed communities. And that's why I'm so passionate about doing everything as a nation and individually and collectively and through great organizations like Greenhouse to just add some horsepower to that great potential that's out there.
And just finally, as well, the power of sport in terms of activism. Obviously, you in your role, World Athletics, took a tough decision regarding Russia long before the latest, difficulties that have beset Europe, but also as well athletes in recent years, and in fact, even back to obviously the Black Power salutes in the 60s. But the power of sport to affect change within society.
Well, again, I've been privileged to witness that. All right, we talked about Moscow. I did go to Moscow on the basis that, I actually like to think that, all right, it was a few more years, but that was the beginning of the infancy of change. I sat just randomly, I sat at the Afro-Asian opening ceremony, the Afro-Asian Games, the opening ceremony in 2004 in Hyderabad. At that moment, India and Pakistan were effectively, sadly, on a war footing. There were incursions and shootings across the border. Two groups of foreign ministers met discreetly in the margins of the Afro-Asian Games to try to discuss how they could reduce tensions and the re-implementation of a test match between India and Pakistan was what they came up with. And it did, to a certain extent, help. I've seen North and South Korea walk into the same stadium when politicians had not got within a country mile of that. East and West Timor in the Sydney Games. Time and time again, I've seen the impact that sport has had, the famous ping pong diplomacy that allowed, Kissinger to make that discreet trip to China and Nixon to start the discussions to try and normalize relationships. It's there, and it's historic, and it's real time.
Yes. Well, listen, Lord Coe, you've been at the forefront of sport and you've been a fantastic ambassador, both on the track and in everything you've done since. It was a pleasure talking to you on the eve of 2012, and it's a pleasure talking to you on another sunny day today. So listen, thank you so much for sparing your time. Best of luck getting through your in tray, and we just really appreciate it.
No, I've really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Playbook with Seb Coe. As I mentioned at the start, 2022 is Greenhouse Sports' 20th anniversary. Please do check out the incredible work they do by visiting greenhousesport.org. And if you'd like to get involved and help, please do get in touch. All the details are on their website. And please do share, rate, and review this episode wherever you can. Thank you very much for listening. And until next time, goodbye.